Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently we are in Judges chapter 10. Quick reminder, this is a simple study, so that's why I don't do a lot of exegesis and eages and exegesis. I'm being funny here, but it's just a simple study, and as we move through, especially through this section of the Old Testament, a lot of it is self-explanatory. That's why the commentary is very not as in depth. We can let the story in itself speak for itself. The Judges, the period of the Judges is a hot mess, as we're going to see. All right, so let's get right to it. Judges chapter 10. And this is after Abimelech. Verse 1 says, after Abimelech, Tola son of Puah, son of Dodo, became judge and began to deliver Israel. He was from Issachar and lived in Shemer in the hill country of Ephraim. Tola judged Israel 23 years, and when he died, he was buried in Shemer. After him came Jair, Gilead, and who judged Israel for 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 towns in Gilead, which all were called Jair's village to this day. And when Jair died, he was buried in Kamon. Now, what's kind of not emphasized here, but we can see, is already you see the corrupt rulership, privilege, right here. His sons, he had 30 sons, 30 donkeys, 30 towns. Okay, so remember, the backdrop between all of these judges is the wickedness of Israel. In this period, they keep falling into pagan worship, to sin, and this is why you have these judges. Verse 6, then the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They worshipped the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the god of Aram, Sidon, and Moab, the god of the Amorites and the Philistines. They abandoned Yahweh and did not worship him, so the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he sold them to the Philistines and the Amorites. They shattered and crushed the Israelites that year, and for 18 years they did the same to all the Israelites who were on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of the Amorites and Gilead. The Amorites also crossed the Jordan, fought against Judah, Benjamin, the house of Ephraim. Israel was greatly oppressed, so they cried out to the Lord, saying, we have sinned against you. We have abandoned our God and worship the Baals. So you would see this continual, and I'm going to say what this shows more than the fact that Israel sinned, that God's mercy, remember, is being showcased more. Why? Because he keeps forgiving them. He keeps, but this is his response to their repeated sin. The Lord said to the Israelites, when the Egyptians, Amorites, Philistines, Sidonians, Amalekites, and the Mannonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, did I not deliver you from their power? But you have abandoned me and worship other gods. Therefore, I will not deliver you again. Go cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your oppression. Now, it's kind of interesting because, of course, God would be totally just if he did that, right? Because repeatedly Israel sinned. He would be totally just. And in the sense, he's telling them, like, you go, and all of these gods that you worship, the ones that you made, the Ashtoreth poles, the images, golden images, whatever. Verse 15, he says, but the Israelites says, we have sinned. Deal with us as you see fit. Only deliver us today. So they got rid of their foreign gods among them and worshiped the Lord. and he became weary of Israel's misery. Now, the term, when you see these terms here, I might be a little off in this description here. I want to concede that. But these terms could be defined as anthropomorphic terms. And what that simply means is describing God in human terms. Okay? Now, that said, I, from a theological perspective, could be misusing that term. But I think it fits here. When it says that he became weary, in other words, God, and when it shows, as I said, when you look at the Old Testament, that it always says that, the thing you hear most about the Old Testament is how angry God is. He's the God of wrath, right? And in some cases, I think that's kind of an attack of Satan, because it diverts. Why is he angry, right? As we're reading here, why is God angry? Because Israel repeatedly sins. They repeatedly blaspheme, rebel against God. But more that every single time he forgives them and delivers them. So this is more showing the mercy of God. So whatever you see, the kind of phrase here that you put human attributes, okay, to God. That's anthropomorphic here. In other words, when we speak of our weariness, is of course a lot different than God's, but the writer here is conveying emotions. How do you do that with the invisible God, right? So you use what's called anthropomorphic terms, right? So verse 17, the Amorites were called together, and they camped in Gilead. So the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. The rulers of Gilead said one to another, "Which man will lead and fight against the Amorites? He will be leader of the inhabitants of the of Gilead." Chapter 11. So Jephthah. Now this is going to be a very interesting story here. Okay. So Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a great warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. And Gilead was his father, and Gilead's wife bore him sons. And when they grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You will have no inheritance in our father's house, because you are the son of another woman." Now we would use the term bastard. Actually, that term is kind of outdated right now. We don't use that, but that's usually what it means. When it says the son of another woman, the term back in the day was bastard, simply meaning that you were born from an unwed. The parents weren't married. And of course, when the terms of another woman, you know that the term another woman is a prostitute. Now, under the law, they were not allowed in the assembly, and they certainly couldn't be priests. Verse 3. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Then some lawless men joined Jephthah and traveled with him. Sometime later, the Amorites fought against Israel, and when the Amorites made war with Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. They said to him, "Come, be our commander, and let us fight against the Amorites." Now remember, Jephthah was a great warrior, so they was kind of like, "Oh, we probably messed up by dissing him, by sending them away." Verse 7, Jephthah replied to the elders of Gilead, "Didn't you hate me and drive me away from my father's house? Why then have you come to me now when you're in trouble?" They answered Jephthah, "Since that is true, we now turn to you. Come with us, fight the Amorites, and you will become our leader. You become leader of all the inhabitants of Gilead." Gilead. I'm sorry. Verse 9. So Jephthah said to him, if you are bringing me back to fight the Amorites, and the Lord give them to me, I will be your leader. The elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, the Lord is our witness if we don't do as you say. So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people put him over themselves as leaders and commanders, and Jephthah repeated all his terms in the presence of the Lord at Mizpah. So Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the Amorites, saying, what do you have against me that you have come to fight against me and my land? The king of the Amorites said to Jephthah's messengers, when Israel came from Egypt, they seized my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok and the Jordan. Now restore it peaceably. Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the Amorites to tell them, this is what Jephthah says, Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of the Amorites, but when they came from Egypt, Israel traveled through the wilderness to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh. Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, please let us travel through your land. But the king of Edom would not listen. They also sent messengers to the king of Moab, but he refused. So Israel stayed in Kadesh. Then they traveled through the wilderness around the lands of Edom, Moab. They came to the east side of the land of Moab, camped on the other side of Arnon, but did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was the boundary of Moab. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites. Now, he's kind of giving them this history lesson. I want to emphasize, notice that history is important. Notice he's repeating this, okay? So notice how important just remembering history here. Verse 19, then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, king of Heshbon. Israel said to him, please let us travel through your land to our country. But Sihon would not trust Israel to pass through his territory. Instead, Sihon gathered all his people, camped at Jahaz, and fought with Israel. Then the Lord of God of Israel handed over Sihon and all his people to Israel, and they defeated him. So Israel took possession of the entire land of the Amorites who lived in the country. They took possession of all the territory of the Amorites, from the Arnon to Jabbok, from the wilderness to the Jordan. The God of Israel has now driven out, the God of the Israelites has now driven out the Amorites before his people, Israel. And will you now force us out? Isn't it true that you may possess whatever your God, Chismos, drives out for you? And we may possess everything the Lord our God drives out before us. Now he's kind of pitting, right, the two gods, right? And by the way, let's just say this: the pagan gods are not real. Okay, so there's not been one pagan god in history that has manifested itself in reality. God is the only God. This is why you have these repeated acts from God. The passing of the Red Sea, the plaguing, the plagues of Egypt. And then, of course, raising up the judges, Joshua. All of these miraculous acts has God manifest himself, which again brings to mind why does Israel continue to fall into pagan worship when they have a better testimony than any other nation. Verse 23, I'll read 23 again. The Lord God of Israel has now driven out the Amorites before his people. And when you force us out, is it true that you may possess whatever God, your God, Chemes drives out before you? And we may possess everything the Lord our God drives out before us. Now, are you better than Balak, son of Zippor, and the king of Moab? Did he ever contend with Israel and fight against them? While Israel lived 300 years in Heshbah and its villages, in Aram and its villages, and in the cities that are in the banks of Emma, why didn't you take them back at that time? I have not sinned against you, but you have wronged me by fighting against me. Let the Lord, who is the judge, decide today between the Israelites and Amorites. But the king of the Amorites would not listen to Jephthah's messengers that he had sent to them. Now, what's interesting about this is this, again, repeating of the history. And as you can, we're getting around the 300-year mark in the term of the book of Judges, as he says here, right? We lived in Israel for 300 years. All right, 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, who traveled through Gilead and Manasseh, and through Mizpah of Gilead. He crossed over the Amorites from Mizpah of Gilead. Jephthah made this vow to the Lord: if you will hand over the Amorites to me, whatever comes out of the doors of my house to greet me, when I return in peace of the Amorites will belong to the Lord, and I will offer it as a burnt offering. I will come back to this in a moment. Verse 32. And Jephthah crossed over the Amorites and fought against them, and the Lord handed them over to him. And he defeated 20 of their cities with a great slaughter, from Aor all the way to the entrance of Minnith and to the Abel-Kerim. So the Amorites were subdued before the Israelites. And when Jephthah went to his home in Mizpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with tamarines and dancing. She was his only child, and he had no other sons or daughters besides her. And when he saw her, towards his clothes, and said, "No, not my daughter. You have devastated me. You have brought great misery on me. I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." Then she said to him, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said, for the Lord brought vengeance on your enemies, the Amorites." So she also said to her father, "Let me do this one thing. Let me wander 2 months through the mountains with my friends to mourn my virginity." "Go," he said, and he sent her away 2 months. So she left with her friends and mourned her virginity as she wandered through the mountains. And at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, and he kept his vow he had made about her, and she never had been intimate with a man. Now it became a custom in Israel that 4 days each year the young women of Israel would commemorate the daughter of Jephthah and the Gileadite. Now, this is a very interesting story, of course. One, it was a foolish mistake for Jephthah to make a vow. Under the law, when you made a vow, it was binding. Now, at no time did you have to make a vow. And this is kind of the foolishness of people, because Jephthah, God would have given him victory, plain and simple, if he had prayed and asked. But he made this vow. So under the law, when you make the vow, it was binding. You had to keep it. You could not get out of it. There's other questions about whether or not if Jephthah's daughter, because in other words, would he have killed her or whatever? And I think the context became clear that he offered her, and that she became a maid. In other words, she did not ever get married again, and that was sort of the fulfillment of the vow which he had made. Okay, it's sad because, again, it shows how foolish sometimes we can be, thinking and not kind of knowing the Lord. But it is kind of foolish that he did not have to make that vow. As I said, God would have given him the victory anyway. So it's sad. So she lived her life as a maid, okay, as we call them. In fact, they call them, back in the day, used to call them old maids. meaning women who did not marry. Of course, it was even frowned upon, but in this case, Jephthah had to do it to fulfill his vow. All right, guys, chapter what am I looking? Chapter 12 in the next study. All right, I'll see you then.